inspiring session. One thing I would take away from that, and I have noticed many times on meeting politicians, they're people too. They have aunties and uncles and children and friends, and it is relatively easy to find a way in which some of your scientific knowledge can help those people that they care about. So keep an ear out for stories when they tell you something about their life. Do try and hook in and hook your science into their personal life. Sounds odd, but it's something to do. Next, we have a very special speaker. So this is the 18th year of Science Meets Parliament. I feel like we've finally become an adult. We can vote now and we can drink. But the event has connected thousands of scientists with hundreds of politicians, and it's a huge amount of effort to organise every year. Why do we do it? Why do you all come here? Well, the person we have speaking next is probably the best placed to tell us. He was the inventor of Science Meets Parliament. Professor Ken Baldwin also continues to be an active research scientist and a heavily politically engaged ambassador for science. So please welcome to the stage Professor Ken Baldwin.
Thank you, Emma, for that very generous introduction. And I thought I'd talk a little bit today about some of the collaborations and connections that Science Meets Parliament engenders, and with a few anecdotal stories tell you how Science Meets Parliament has a very long running effect and outcome that you will all be part of in the next 2 days. So first of all, just a little bit of history. So you'll see that sitting up on the wall here, there's this flag that says Science Meets Parliament. And the reason that we had flags, as you can see on the screen, adorning the avenues of Canberra in the weeks before the event, was that back in 1999, nobody had ever tried something like Science Meets Parliament. And we had a lot of discussion internally in what was then Federation of Australian Scientific and Technological Societies, the precursor to STA, about whether this was actually going to work. Could it be a huge flop? And so we thought, and I'll come back to this as to why SmP works, we thought that what we have to do is absolutely go out there from day one and hit the ground running and completely saturate Parliament with science for 2 days. And so we didn't hold back. So we got the rights to put flags on the flagpoles across Commonwealth Avenue and Kings Avenue Bridge for up to a month before the event. Everyone at Science Meets Parliament wore little blue badges, which you can see on the screen there. I've got one of the original 1999 ones that I'm wearing today. This meant that when you looked at question time on TV, what you saw was a sea of blue in Parliament. So every parliamentarian got a badge as well, and they all wore it on the day. And this is before people wore ribbons, badges, anything. This is way before that. So our initial approach to Science Meets Parliament was blatant advertising, and it worked. So we of course, had to engage with the parliamentarians as well. That was a huge part of it. And so we did an awful lot of legwork at the beginning to get the Minister for Science across the line, get the Shadow Minister for Science across the line. And once we'd done that, everything fell into place. So just a few historical pictures. Here's myself meeting with my local members. So there was Bob McMullen on the left there, the Labor member for Canberra, and on the right, Gary Nairn, the then member for Eden Monero. Both of these members of Parliament were inspirational in terms of providing us with the support that we needed and to talking to their colleagues about how important it was to engage with Science Meets Parliament. So we owe them a great debt of gratitude. And indeed, they were my referees for the Eureka Prize, which I won back in 2004. And you can see Peter McGorran, 5 years after the first Science Meets Parliament, is still wearing a blue badge. So that was very important. Then, of course, I mean, you know, after a while, advertising wears off and you have to do different things. So we didn't have any blue badges anymore. So when I became STA president, we had a different style of badge that time. We still had the flag. You can see the flag sitting in the background. And by then, Science Meets Parliament had become an institution. So, you know, we met obviously with the Minister, chief scientists, important people from business. You can see that Science Meets Parliament really had come of age by then. So that was a decade after its foundation. And still it continues to be relevant. And so the question that you should ask yourself, okay, is why does Science Meets Parliament work? There are not many examples of Science Meets Parliament around the world. I actually went to the United States and talked to people who had what is known as Congressional Visits Day to work out what the success of that was. And let me tell you, it's not nearly as successful. And the reason is that it's a small event. I mean, Congress is a big place, but they don't have hundreds and hundreds of scientists meeting with hundreds of parliamentarians all on the one day. It's much more diffuse. And I think that's what makes Science Meets Parliament so successful. That is that we just absolutely saturate Parliament with science for 2 days. And it's this saturation that makes it work, because when a parliamentarian talks to their neighbour about what happened in their day, they're all talking science. And it's this collective synergy that really makes things work. And indeed, I wrote a little bit about this in the conversation this morning. You can see the link on the page there. And that talks about some of the reasons that Science Meets Parliament actually works. So you'll be a part of this. There are hundreds of you. There are hundreds of parliamentarians out there that you'll meet. You probably won't meet all of them, but it's important that Science Meets Parliament meets a good fraction of parliamentarians every year, at least 50%. That should be the goal. Because when you do that, that's when the synergy happens. If we only met with 5 or 10%, as happens in the US and in other countries, it doesn't work so well. And it's your enthusiasm and your excitement that generates the same enthusiasm and excitement amongst the parliamentarians. Okay, so we've talked about the benefits. So to some degree, it's really a great thing that you have such good stories to tell. And you should tell them with passion. You should engender excitement in your meeting with your parliamentarian and their advisors. And in this way, you help close the virtuous cycle that says that we reinforce the great things that science does by telling the people who fund the science the exciting stories that you have in your everyday working life. So that's an extremely important benefit, because it means that the parliamentarians that you talk to are then your allies. Okay, so when they have a decision to make about using science, about supporting science, they'll think back to the meeting that they had with you, and they'll remember the excitement that they experienced for the first time, hearing from a scientist all the wonderful things that you do for society. And that just sits in the back of their mind, so one day when they have to make an important decision that involves science, they'll remember that conversation with you. Now, it's not always easy to predict what the meeting's going to be like in some cases. And so when you get into your group of 2 or 3 and you go into the room, sometimes you're met with blank stares. And sometimes you're met with people that just want to talk all about themselves. And sometimes they want to talk about anything except science. But these are rare, I would suggest. And then there are some exceptions, like this guy here, Senator David Johnson, Senator for 2001 to 2016. And back in one of the early Science Meets Parliaments, he met with 3 scientists and he buttonholed them for 2.5 hours. Instead of having just a quick hello, meet and greet, see you later, he was there 2.5 hours later still talking science. The really interesting thing is, later he became a minister. Okay, so that's a really important message. You might think you've been given a backbencher from, the middle of nowhere that you don't really have any connection with. Just remember that backbencher one day could become a minister, and indeed they will then make important decisions about science and that need science. So the benefit number 1 is, of course, that you transfer your enthusiasm and excitement for science to the parliamentarians. Benefit number 2 is that for the scientists, for you, this is a professional development exercise. It's about understanding the way that the parliamentary system works. It's about how to get messages across. It's about how to engage with key decision makers and give them the one piece of information that they need to make a difference. And so from that perspective, Science Meets Parliament has been hugely successful. It's as Emma just said, it's brought thousands of scientists together. In fact, if we're on, is that the fire alarm? I think we have to evacuate.
Fire alarm system is operated. Stand by for further instruction.
There we go. So we standing by? Yep, we'll stand by and wait to what they say.
The fire alarm system is operated. Stand by for further instruction.
So just wait.
Warning. The fire alarm system is operated. Stand by for further instruction. Warning. The fire alarm system is operated. Stand by for further instruction. Warning. The fire alarm system is operated. Stand by for further instruction. Warning. The fire alarm system is operated. Stand by for further instruction. Warning. The fire
So we're just in touch with the building managers and we'll let you know. But I think they've turned it off. They're all good to go. All right, very good. As you were. That's right. So, so when it comes to the benefit from the perspective of scientists, if you look at the 18 events that we've had, and we have of the order of 200 to 250 scientists involved in each one, that's over 3,000 scientists, given that some of them come back a couple of times. And indeed, hundreds of politicians have participated in this event. And of course, people early in their careers are obviously influenced by what they see and what they do. And let me just give you one example, and that is our very own Emma Johnston, who was I think, at the very inaugural Science Meets Parliament back in 1999, Emma, is that right? Yes, there we go. So Emma is a foundation member of Science Meets Parliament from when she was a PhD student, and she has been, of course, through the event many times in the intervening years. So professional development is an important outcome as well. And then finally, and this is perhaps the greatest benefit, and that is that lasting networks are created. You'll have seen the pictures of some of the parliamentarians that I met and who are now counted as my friends, in fact. And these networks that are created mean that the benefit of Science Meets Parliament goes much beyond the event of the day. It goes geographically beyond it, because parliamentarians then visit scientific establishments with the people that they meet through Science Meets Parliament, and it goes on through time through the scientific and parliamentary careers of the participants. And indeed, my own Vice-Chancellor, Brian Schmidt, the Nobel Prize winner and the person who spoke for the Nobel Prize winners in the Lindau Declaration on Climate Change a couple of years ago, was early in his career a participant at Science Meets Parliament in his early days at ANU. And he still talks about the friends he made in the formative years when he first experienced Science Meets Parliament. There's Brian with one of his SmP friends. And earlier in the day...
The alarm was found to be a false alarm. Visitors, please continue to enjoy your stay.
Thank you for that. And I'll give you just one other example. So...
Attention, please. The alarm was found to be a false alarm. Visitors, please continue to enjoy your stay. Wardens, please return to normal duties.
I think we got that. And just one other example was my former PhD student, Shubho Banerjee, who presented here this morning. and who's now Deputy Secretary of the Department of Education and Training. So Shubo went on from doing laser and atmospheric physics at ANU to become a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He then went and undertook other professional roles. As he said, he was very interested in climate change and areas of policy around that. And the next time that I met him was at Science Meets Parliament, when I entered the office of Labor Minister Bob McMullen, and he was Bob McMullen's advisor. Okay, so this whole cycle had come around, and again this year he's back at Science Meets Parliament. So I think these little anecdotes just show you how some of these networks really do last a very long time. So just to finish off, a few anecdotes maybe about some of the networks you don't want to encourage. One of the big issues when it comes to Science Meets Parliament is working out the seating plan at the dinner. And I do remember a number of occasions where we went to great lengths to seat the right climate scientists, not necessarily at the same table as, but in not too distant proximity from, former WA MP David Jensen's table, who's a well-known person with particular views on climate, or indeed on current climate denier and Queensland Senator Malcolm Roberts' table. That would be also a very interesting conversation. So you have all these interesting little networks and things that you try and encourage in these areas. People ask me, what was the worst moment I've ever had in Science Meets Parliament? And I think it's got to be hearing that Prime Minister John Howard had to attend a division and wasn't able to meet with me. So there went my opportunity to meet the Prime Minister. What was my best moment in Science Meets Parliament? Well, there are many of those, but I think it's got to be watching Tony Abbott at a Science Meets Parliament hypothetical when he was Health Minister, and saying that if there was a pandemic, an international pandemic, then he would close the borders. And the really interesting thing was actually many years later, when he was Prime Minister, doing that prophylactically. Thank you very much.